Hello, everyone. This is Gideon Fiddleside, VP Haymarket Studios and Editorial Director of Custom at PR Week. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast, the Narrative Attack Influence Operation Playbook. Before I go any further, allow me to thank Blackbird AI for sponsoring this event. I am really excited about today's webcast because it's about such an important topic that impacts every single person who's out there listening today. Perception is no longer just a communications challenge. It is an active attack surface. Threat actors and nation states are engineering harmful narratives using AI, deepfakes, coordinated amplification, and agentic bot networks to shape interpretation, erode trust, and drive behavior at scale across citizens, corporations, financial markets, and governments. The reactive playbook is no longer sufficient. Proactivity is the only way. And if you think your organization and your executives are immune to this scenario, think again. This is a daunting reality that we all will face if we're not facing it already. So fortunately, though, you've tuned into this webcast. Over the next 60 minutes, you're going to learn to differentiate between narrative attacks and misinformation or fake news. They are not quite the same. How a narrative attack actually starts, spreads, and becomes harmful. We're going to talk to you about how to measure narrative risk in real time and so much more. This is really crucial information that we're providing today. So it's a good thing we have a trio of truly esteemed and brilliant leaders to share their wisdom and counsel with us. And it is my honor to bring them into the conversation right now in alphabetical order. Larissa Lacco, Director of National Security at Blackbird AI, who is joining us from Toronto. Hi, Larissa. Nice to see you. Frankie Sagerman, a 30-year NATO veteran, now retired, who is NATO's former head of digital insights and social media, who's giving us a real international flavor today by joining us from Belgium. Frankie, it's nice to see you. And Eileen Scheil, Assistant Vice Provost of Communications and Public Affairs at Weill Cornell Medicine, who is joining us from one of the best cities in the world, New York, which is where I'm as well. Hi, Eileen. Nice to see you as well. So I want to thank you again for joining me today, all three of you. But before we get into the heart of this conversation, allow me a few moments to cover some housekeeping. While a major portion of today's session will be the conversation between myself and Larissa, Frankie, and Eileen, you, our audience, play a key role as well. The final few minutes of this podcast are going to be dedicated to answering your questions. There is a Q&A tab on your screen, probably in the upper left. Please send in your questions throughout this webcast. I'm going to monitor them as they come in, and I will pose as many of them to our speakers as I can in the time that we have. But I am very happy to say that the lessons are not restricted simply to the conversation today. I want to draw your attention to the handouts tab, which should be right next to the Q&A tab on your screen. There are 3 PDFs there courtesy of Blackbird AI. I highly encourage you to check them all out, but download them and check them out after the webcast because you're going to want to pay attention to what we're saying today. Now, I'm sure you're ready to hear from all of our leaders. I know I am. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. And there's a lot we have to cover here. And Larissa, I'm going to start with you with what I think is a pretty good way to break the ice in this conversation. How do you define a narrative attack for an audience that may still be thinking about this primarily as misinformation or fake news? What makes these things structurally different?
Thanks, Gideon. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on today's panel. It's a real pleasure to join Eileen and Frankie. Frankie happens to be a colleague and a friend from a past life, so that makes things extra fun. But thanks for the question and for starting the conversation around this term, narrative attack. So simply it means the manipulation of public perception and the harm that results from it. You mentioned misinformation, disinformation, fake news. I would describe these as lower level tactics that could be used as a part of a narrative attack. A narrative attack is much broader. It's much deeper. I think that to better unpack this, it's important to understand the context that we find ourselves in today. I think it's best understood through the framework of cognitive warfare. And I know that seems to be a dusty old military term, but at the root of it, it comes down to influence. And whether your aim is to maintain public support for an alliance like NATO, or if your goal is to safeguard a growing business, your aim at the end of the day is to influence in order to maintain trust. And today, sometimes there are efforts to undermine that trust. And I think the point that I want to make, coming from NATO and having just joined the private sector not too long ago, is that reputational risk, of course, is not unique to governments. And what's interesting is the way that this risk manifests in different ways for different sectors. And I hope that's something that we can address. I'll just mention three things about narrative attacks that I think are important to take away. So number one, information doesn't have to be false to be harmful, right? We see this all the time, where kernels of truth are taken out of context and used to manipulate audiences. And this works because it lends just a little bit of credibility needed to make a narrative more sticky. And so it doesn't have to be disinformation to be malicious. That's the first thing. Number two, the target is people's minds. So this is what drives human decision making and behaviors. And so what we see through narrative attacks is that human vulnerabilities are leveraged, right? We see confirmation bias is exploited, fear is exploited. And so this is really prioritized over just trying to win a factual argument. And this is oftentimes why things like fact checking, may fall short. And then the last point I'll make, Gideon, is that fundamentally, this is not only a media relations or a PR issue. Yes, these teams are heavily involved, but they are not the only ones who are impacted. And when trust is intentionally weaponized against a corporation, the damage isn't just a bad news cycle, right? The damage could be financial, it could be operational, it could be security. So I think to conclude my answer to this question, narrative attacks, they go much broader, much deeper. And I think defending against this type of threat requires a different approach. And I hope that's something that we can talk about today.
Larissa, thank you so much, and you've already proven why you're such a wonderful person to have on this webcast. I mean, that was really a lot, and it's interesting how you talk about basically hearts and minds. That's kind of what the especially the minds. And it's really funny because communicators and brand marketers, that's also what they've been going after, that's also what they're going after in their efforts. So it's really interesting how they're playing on that same level. So really, really fascinating stuff. I appreciate that. Now, Frankie and Larissa, I'm actually going to tap into your vast time at NATO for this next question. Frank, I'll probably start with you just to give Larissa a little bit of a break here. But you've both spent decades in NATO watching influence operations evolve firsthand. The same threat actors and nation states that are actively targeting NATO with narrative attacks are also targeting brands. But most CCOs and CMOs probably don't have any idea. So when did that line between geopolitical influence operations and corporate reputation risk effectively disappear? And Frankie, I'll start with you.
Well, I would argue that this line didn't disappear all at once. It sort of faded over time. 20 years ago, we mainly saw state actors targeting elections, political movements, military conflicts, and companies were more collateral damage in the narrative and not the main target. But with the growth and more prominent role of social media platforms, the industry started to play a broader role, and technology platforms were seen as potential influencers of elections and became sort of the managers of information flows. So the threat actors changed their influence operations, as Larissa just said, and trust became the new battlefield. It was easier to attack trust and belief than systems. So a narrative no longer needed mainstream media and could be launched at scale through social media networks. And this is where we started to see the shift, and companies were targeted and attacks were aimed at product safety, corporate integrity, data security. And then lastly, around the COVID period, and especially post-COVID, it became obvious that the threat actors, so to them, the same networks, the same influence operations, the same amplification mechanisms, and often the same audience segmentation they used could be used against governments, institutions, universities, individuals, because that separation between national security threats and reputational threats eroded completely. And today's influence campaigns often produce both threats simultaneously. And this is also what could be observed for NATO, because from the perspective of an influence operator, the playbook is effectively the same thing, only the desired outcome is slightly different. And finally, of course, generative AI has dramatically facilitated and amplified the narrative attacks, but I think this is part of a broader discussion later.
Absolutely. And Larissa, I obviously want to give you an opportunity because you spent some time in NATO as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think Frankie covered it. If I were to add anything, I would say that, nation states have economic goals to obtain, right? And that is seen every day through trade, through negotiations, et cetera. So, when we look at state-sponsored influence activity, of course, private companies are going to be targeted, especially in sectors that nation states deem important, like the AI industry, for example, the energy sector. So, I think Frankie had mentioned like data centers, spreading false information around, data centers being a cost to the average taxpayer, for example. So it is really interesting, I think, how these two worlds have sort of collided. And I think, especially when you think about the economic lens, that tends to make a lot of sense.
Now, one of the reasons I was really excited to have Eileen join this is because obviously she is a communicator, one of the best ones out there. And as Larissa and Frankie both noted, while this is not just a communications issue, one of the reasons communicators are so important in this conversation is because they are so central to the entire organization. The one thing that they are going to do, communicators are probably going to raise the alarm to every other part of the company that this is really something that you have to pay attention to. So your perspective, Eileen, is going to be vital here. Not to mention, you work in the healthcare sector, which is also one of the sectors that might be a little bit more not immune. That really wasn't the word I was looking for, but it's the best one I can come up with. Not immune to this situation. So, as a global, sometimes my English isn't great, but you get the point. You're a global communications leader in the healthcare sector. You have been for quite a while. So, in your view, when did narrative threats stop feeling like a PR problem and start feeling like an operational risk? And what was the moment or pattern for you when this threat really became tangible?
Thanks, Gideon. It's great to see you, and it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I would say, even just a couple of years ago, things were so different than they are today. Healthcare truly is on the front line of narrative attacks. For those of us who work directly in patient care, aside from other healthcare industry organizations, trust is really a key factor for clinical performance. So, patients want to put their trust in their doctors and their healthcare systems. In addition, other healthcare organizations, broadly defined, including insurance companies and others, are under direct operational attacks. You've seen or heard in the news about cyber attacks that have disrupted payments of the claims or patient services. Operating room schedules shut down the operating rooms in certain hospitals. Pharmacy operations, so it prevents people from getting critical medications when they need them, or access to healthcare in general at a national level. I think misinformation also plays, a key role here. It's really pushed people to decline vaccines, to reject public health measures, and to really use treatments that are completely unproven. And this is more than a communications issue. It's a patient safety issue as well. I think communication leaders really have to, pay close attention to developing issues and really sort of act more like a detective or investigator, helping to connect those dots. Like you mentioned, sometimes communications offices are the first line to see what's happening, and they're identifying sort of the red flags and the threats that really can evolve. So getting your institution together quickly, mobilizing a team to get together to discuss this well beyond communications, really getting experts at the table. And that's really shifting and changing as these issues really change and become much more complicated.
Thank you so much for that. And This is the opportunity I'm going to take to remind everyone in our audience, please do send in some questions. We are going to get to them towards the end. And if some of them are particularly well timed with what we're talking about at the moment, I might want to throw in a couple in the middle. And actually, that is one thing I'm actually going to do right now. So, Larissa, we have a specific question for you that I have every confidence you'll be able to answer brilliantly. So bear with me as I do this technological dance of mine. Here we are. So one of our audience members would like for you to give an example to demonstrate the distinction between misinformation that goes viral and I'm reading this question actually verbatim. Can you give an example to demonstrate the distinction between misinformation that goes viral and reputational damage and narrative attacks? So if there's something concrete, like you could tell people, this is misinformation, this is a narrative attack, that really, really kind of crystallizes what the difference between the two is. I fumbled that question a little bit, but I think you get what I'm asking.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So I think we get this question a lot. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that misinformation is unintentional false information, right? It's information that is false, that can spread. However, it may not necessarily have a deliberate, malicious aim behind it. I think when we talk about narrative attacks, certainly in our field, we do specialize in better understanding the deliberate malicious intent behind it. So, for example, uncovering, the specific actors that are at play, the specific networks that are at play. We can also, of course, do this with misinformation as well. But I think that the difference is that misinformation is false information that is not intended to mislead. But, for example, just piggybacking off of what Eileen was talking about, there's a lot of, for example, misinformation in the health space, and, people meaning well, but unfortunately propagating, health claims that are simply untrue. So that's the distinction there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. We are now going to move on to the section of our webcast that's I'm going to call it the threat landscape. Okay. And Larissa, I know it seems like I'm picking on you, but it just happens to be the order of the questions as I have them. Don't worry, Eileen and Frankie, you will have plenty to say as well. But so one of the bullet points, this actually gets to one of the bullet points I specified in the beginning of the beginning of the webcast. So now, Larissa, I know that you've led information environment assessments that fed directly into NATO defense policy. Wow, I got to talk to you more about that someday. That sounds absolutely fascinating. But I would like for you to walk us through how a narrative attack actually starts, spreads, and then becomes harmful. And what does a coordinated narrative attack campaign actually look like at the seeding stage before most organizations even know they are being targeted?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And I think this is the right question to focus on, because the more familiar we are with understanding how a narrative attack unfolds, the better positioned we are to be able to intervene at the right moment. So in our industry, we map out this life cycle called a narrative kill chain. The full kill chain has about 10 steps, but I think for simplicity's sake, let's just look at three core phases. I'll call them reconnaissance, seeding, and then dissemination and amplification. And to be completely honest, the earliest stages of an attack can seem totally invisible to an organization. So first, with reconnaissance, this is really the planning stage where threat actors collect information about target audiences, they identify their vulnerabilities so that they're able to craft narratives that actually resonate. Then the second step is seeding. So what you alluded to in your question. So here, narratives play a crucial role in how people perceive the world. And in this phase, the narratives are planted, they're actively tested among key audiences. And a lot of this actually happens away from the mainstream, and it happens on the fringe platforms. And this is done in an effort to understand which storylines, are gaining traction. And actually, I remember a great example of this from my time at NATO, and Frankie's going to remember this example as well. During the pandemic, in 2021, we had our enhanced forward presence military battle groups stationed in the Baltic countries, and they were targeted by a hostile narrative attack. So what happened was adversaries planted fake documents on local blogs claiming that newly rotated NATO soldiers were heavily infected with COVID and they were going to spread it to local communities. There were also articles about NATO withdrawing troops from the region. And so what they did was they took that kernel of truth, which was the routine rotation of troops, and they wrapped it around with a narrative that would really stick. And the reason I bring this up is because this was detected at the seeding stage. And so the great thing was that there wasn't this massive, dissemination and amplification of these narratives. And that's because the NATO teams were able to catch that at the seeding stage. They were able to expose the fake documents and neutralize the story before an adversary could really fully activate their infrastructure. And so they disrupted the kill chain at that moment. And I think it's important to note that the reason that we map out these phases is to be able to understand when can we anticipate and when can we intervene, what are the indicators that we need to look for in order to respond. And I'll just say, the third phase is that dissemination and amplification phase where most organizations traditionally, that's when they finally detect a campaign, right? After it has already had quite of an impact. And so this is where we see threat actors using their information ecosystem, their infrastructure, their networks in order to disseminate those narratives. And I think, the bottom line here is that you can't defend a perimeter that you can't see. And so being able to detect those tactics in the early pre-amplification window is really important.
No, thank you so much for that. And I can't help but hear all three of you talking and just trying to think back to conversations I've had with communicators 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where I would have never thought any of this would be talked about. And it's just kind of amazing. But then again, for anyone out there who questions how important communicators are to their brands, if this conversation doesn't really hammer home the fact of how important you guys are, the line of defense that you are, I don't know what will. So I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I definitely thought that was worth noting. Now, Frankie, Larissa, you're going to get a little bit of a break now because, Frank, I'm going to bring you into the conversation right now. So you have briefed audiences from ambassadors to military practitioners. So you have been involved in some of the most important issues in the world that are going on at any one given time. So you've seen firsthand how the same playbook that nation states use against governments get redeployed against corporations. So which sectors have you seen get targeted the most, and what tactics have you observed?
Well, the sectors most frequently targeted tend to be those where public perception directly affects customer behavior or national security. So these can range from, as mentioned before, technology and AI companies, cybersecurity, energy and natural resources, pharmaceutical and healthcare, financial services, etc., etc. But as far as tactics are concerned, they are being sort of copied over. And I just want to share three of the most commonly used tactics which are being redeployed in targeting these corporations. So the first one is called the amplification of existing divisions. So rather than inventing a new narrative, they identify the opposing communities and then intensify the conflict by creating false narratives, again with that kernel of truth that Larissa mentioned earlier. So they push both sides towards more extreme positions. And then you see coordinated posting across different platforms, repetition of identical talking points, and artificial trending of the story. So there's a lot of artificial push to get that story trending. The underlying issue is often real, but the manipulation is in the escalation in combining those fabricating narratives. The second one is a tactic which is also frequently used as leaking supposedly hacked documents or hacked documents. So you will see that they obtained the emails or documents through hacking or leaks, or they even produce fake hack documents, so documents which weren't hacked at all. They are being released more selectively to make it a bit more obscure and secretive, but there is still that coordinated media and social media amplification. So whereas the information itself might be genuine, here the manipulation comes from context, timing, and more selective disclosure to selective groups. And the third one, which is frequently used, is what is called narrative laundering. So they do this through what is called pink slime websites. So these are actually not genuine media websites, but they have the look and feel of a media website. So at first sight, if you look at it, you'd think this is a real media website. And where they also do the laundering is through what is called doppelganger, which means they copy existing websites and they change a small part of the URL. So when you first look at it, you have the idea that you're on the original Guardian web page, but actually it's a completely fake web page. So there the workflow is that the anonymous account publishes the claim, and then these fringe outlets or pink slime websites support that claim or sort of whitewash it. The influencers start amplifying it. Sometimes even mainstream media falls into the trap and covers the story. And thus the claim gets more legitimacy through the repetition. So these attempts are rarely standalone posts, but they are done over a very, very long period of time. And we're talking months and even years here, because threat actors, they know that changing behavior is not done overnight. So it's a lengthy process. So they have to continue doing the same effort over a longer period of time. And again, all these examples are more recently boosted with the help of AI, both at the creation level, but also at the dissemination level. And I think this is the real threat for the future.
This is really making me appreciate how timely this conversation is as well. So thank you for that. Now, Eileen, Frankie just mentioned healthcare as one of the sectors where this is really, really prominent. So I'd like for you to, oh, I'm sorry.
He's going to keep me awake at night with that one.
Yeah, well, okay. I do want you to get some sleep, but this is important stuff. So I mean, we definitely have to be paying attention to it, obviously. So, but Eileen, I'd like you to go over some specific examples or case studies from the healthcare sector. But what does that threat look like from the inside, and how does it differ from the reputational risks most communications leaders are trained to manage? Because communicators are very well adept at handling risk, but this is different. So how are you handling this when a lot of this stuff is still a little bit new, even to someone as experienced as you?
Yeah, thanks, Gideon. This is definitely not a communications crisis playbook, a normal playbook. Today's threats seem to be much more out of our control. They're difficult to fix and require a lot more expertise than normally organizations have in-house. Really highly specialized partners who have capabilities that we just don't have. I'll give you an example. We recently discovered that a bad actor stole one of our prominent physicians' identity and created a fake social media Facebook account. They stole her image, her title. They copied her badge, employee badge, used our brand, our logo, credentials from our website. This was from our corporate website. And they used this information to reach out to vulnerable people and patients to sell fake supplements to patients for a medical condition that these supplements didn't even exist. They were fake, charging about $800 per patient from what we can tell. And the only reason we learned about this is we started getting calls from patients saying, hey, I paid online for a service that I didn't receive. What's going on? So that sort of escalated red flag to our team to say something's not right here. And when we really looked into this and learned, how to spend many, many months, many, many man hours and women hours trying to figure out how to reverse this and correct it and stop it from happening. What was happening, to Frankie's point, is they found like another way to attack. So they created fake doctors, didn't use our doctors off our website, but used fake AI doctors and created profiles and continued to solicit money from people still using our corporate logo and identity. So this is really defrauding people, threatening patient trust. It impacts our reputation because, we didn't really have a way to report this for patients. It was just they were calling randomly into the doctor's office to ask why they weren't receiving what they thought they purchased from us. So the credibility is lost among patients and the public. Even, they believe this to be true and it's not. So initially, we tried really hard to bring this down by ourselves, but we ended up having to go outside for help to really find specialized partners who could help us tackle this.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that example, and I do also want to thank all of you in our audience. You guys are sending in a lot of questions, which is terrific. Please do keep sending them in. And once again, before we get into the next segment of this conversation, and I actually think I'm going to throw an audience question in there right now. Now, Larissa, this is probably for you, though it wasn't specifically directed at you, so I'm going to put it out to the group. But I think Larissa might be the one to answer this. But anyway, this is still often framed as a cybersecurity problem. But in reality, it plays out through public narratives, reputation, and trust. So it's not a cybersecurity problem, really. Have you worked with private sector organizations to help them bridge the gap between cybersecurity and communications and legal and other functions? Now, this is a situation where breaking down silos is really, really important. All parts of the company really have to work together. So how have you found what have you found to be the best ways to sort of break those silos and make sure all the teams work together to really tackle this issue? Larissa, it's probably yours, yeah.
Well, I think I'll start, and then I'd actually be curious to hear how others
absolutely
what others think about this. But I think specifically when it comes to cybersecurity, this is very much the two sides of the same coin, and there is really so much overlap. We have worked with a lot of private sector companies who do need support on bridging the gap there. I think, I'll give a few examples where narrative intelligence can support the cyber use case. Number one, on the threat monitoring piece, understanding and being able to track how different hacktivist group, for example, ransomware groups, how they're communicating on different forums, on fringe platforms, on the dark web, and looking again for those risk indicators to maybe help better anticipate when a cyber breach could happen. And then I think on the other side as well, when it comes to incident response, there needs to be a communications element to that as well. So I think we can kind of work on both sides of the cyber use case, both on anticipating, but then also informing communications, to protect reputations of companies. I think when it comes to breaking down the silos, and this is such a common problem in organizations where, you've got this threat monitoring, team, and, they're producing reporting, but then it's not actually feeding into anything, right? So it's really important, like at the strategic level, to make sure that team is supporting the organizational objectives, and it's a cross-functional team that's working with communicators and security leaders and other teams, and making sure that their requirements are being met, because at the end of the day, we are supporting their outputs and their mandates as well. So I think getting better at eliciting requirements from different functional teams is really important.
Thank you. Eileen, I actually have a question for you from the audience, and answer this as specifically or not specifically as you can. But our audience member is actually curious what kind of specialist partners you did hire for this fake medicine example. Like who are you don't have to name names if you don't want to, but what kind of companies what kind of external partners did you work with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of these situations that we're seeing are, you can hire a firm to monitor keywords, but now what we're seeing is screenshots, photographs, things that aren't typically, found through those normal social listening tools. We actually use a company called Doppel, Doppel, I think, and they specialize in that. So I'm happy to share, the name of the company, but it's just the way, the way we monitor things. And I'm going to talk about it in another section here, but is really changing. The typical means of monitoring aren't really helping us catch things that are out there that we really need to identify. And sometimes we're aware of things that we see on social media, and they go way beyond, traditional communication challenges.
Thank you for sharing that. We are now going to move into the part of our conversation I'm going to call practical frameworks and defense strategies. Okay, really tactical stuff here. And okay, Larissa, back to you again. If a communications leader in this audience walked away, and don't walk away for another 25 minutes, by the way, but when they walk away, and if they wanted to build a basic narrative threat monitoring capability, where would you tell them to start?
I think that if you want to move from the reactive firefighting and you want to build something that, ensures that you're monitoring proactively, I would kind of just take the three traditional pillars: people, process, technology. People, I feel like we've kind of already talked about, but, bringing on curious analysts that are specialized in the space. Narrative intelligence is becoming a more specialized and recognized field, which is great. Making sure that team has a cross-functional mandate so that they can support the policymakers, the security teams, the communicators, et cetera. And actually, we work with a lot of companies who don't have analyst teams, but then they, as Eileen was saying, they bring on analysts as part of like a managed service from a company, for example. When it comes to process, I think, I already mentioned cross-functional like 3 times, but I feel like that's really important, ensuring that there are the right workflows and processes in place to ensure that, the teams are actually meeting strategic objectives of the company. And this seems so... it seems so simple, right? But oftentimes, it's common for, these sorts of analyst teams to not be getting enough direction from other cross-functional teams or from their superiors. And I think that is so important for them to be able to understand exactly what requirements they are reporting on. And then finally, I think the technology piece, which is very obvious, right? I mean, as we've discussed the threats today, threats are happening at machine speed. So the response also needs to be at machine speed, right? You don't want to have your analysts sifting through large amounts of data. You want your analysts looking at insights and conveying them for their senior leaders. So technology is a force multiplier in that regard. And I think especially when it comes to detecting manipulation, right? Online manipulation, when you need to better understand, how bots are operating, how much of the conversation is actually being driven by bots, these types of questions that simply, having analysts, work manually, to figure out that type of work. I think today, it's not sustainable. So.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that. And I'm actually glad you mentioned conversations with leadership, because that's kind of where the next couple of questions I'm going to focus on is. And, communicators are very, very accustomed to thinking about, okay, how do I convince the C-suite that this is important, that this is worth the money, that this worked? So these two, I have one question for Frankie and one question for Eileen that really kind of falls into that. And then Frankie, I'm actually going to start with you now. I'm going to ask you about how do you measure narrative risk in real time in a way that is actually understandable to executive leadership and boards who need to act on this information?
I agree. This is one of the hardest problems right now, because these boards don't actually care about disinformation. They only care about the consequences like revenue risk, operational risk, or reputational risk. The mistake many organizations make is only measuring the information environment instead of measuring the business impact of the information environment. Or they strongly focus on solely media monitoring or only the impact of social media and on a combination of all these factors. Most executives don't need to know there are 20,000 negative mentions across 10 different social media platforms in the last 24 hours. The response you will get is, so what? What they actually need to know is how likely will this narrative impact or alter the behavior of investors, customers, employees, or partners in the next 30 or 90 days? This is more an operational objective. Now, what are the dimensions to keep an eye on in real time? These are slightly different than media monitoring and social media monitoring. So what I would carefully focus on is the first one is what is called narrative penetration. So how far has that narrative spread? So the critical metric is not the volume, but it's the movement of that narrative between different audiences, between the different authors and the public. And the second one is the narrative velocity. So how quickly is that narrative spreading? Narratives with a high growth sometimes matter more than the large narratives because they're being favored by the algorithm and they're posted more to the different audiences. And then the third one is the different authors and the narrative stickiness, as I would call it. So who is carrying the narrative and how is it being amplified? Is it a genuine amplification or is it completely artificial? The danger isn't that people are hearing the narrative. The danger is when people start sort of copying and amplifying the narrative. This is and ultimately repeating the disinformation or the bad narrative. The narrative becomes dangerous when it moves from these fringe fake accounts to influential accounts and ultimately into the mainstream media. That's where you completely failed. Now, all of these metrics can no longer be measured with the traditional media monitoring or social media listening tools. A lot of companies are using these, but this is no longer enough. You need to expand your toolkit with very dedicated tools that can measure and track these specific important metrics, because otherwise you're going to fail and you're going to miss the difference between genuine narrative that is trending and a sort of completely fake amplified narrative. And so that's the main difference.
No, thank you so much for that. And the point you made at the very beginning of that comment about how boards and C-suites sometimes they don't care soon enough. Communicators need to make sure that they do care soon enough, because by the time they start caring, the problem is already too big to handle. So all very, very important stuff. And Eileen, sort of in the same area, I want to bring you in on this because you've obviously led communications teams through some pretty complex environments, public companies, global healthcare, you name it. So how do you translate that threat intelligence into executive decision making? And to do that effectively, what do you actually need from technology providers right now in order to do this as effectively as you need to do it?
Thanks, Gideon. And I'm lucky I work for doctors and they are very evidence-based. So you put the data in front of them and they usually, they tend to agree. But no, seriously, I think you have to really be quite proactive. I'll tell you just from my experience, we try to continually learn and monitor, everything. The more you pay attention to how bad actors operate, even as a non-technical expert in the space that Frankie and Elisa are, we can begin to see themes and patterns and like red flags that we've noticed before. It's not a be all end all, but it does start to, some of these patterns are starting to look more familiar. I think catching these threats early is really key. We've had to, like I mentioned before, really augment our current monitoring systems, and not just from a communication standpoint, but from a security IT perspective, across the board, and include services that really specialize in monitoring, like I mentioned earlier, images such as screenshots, more dark web monitoring, which we haven't typically done, years ago, and really beyond, like I said, beyond keyword searches, really, looking at various images of our logo, et cetera. And I think we're able to be much more proactive in looking at sort of identifying high profile executives that tend to be in the media a lot, whether their comments are controversial or not. Some of our physicians, like the example I used with our physician in the fake social media profile, researchers who are really looking at, vaccine safety and efficacy are targets a lot of times with these bad actors, and really to protect our brand as well. So what we end up doing is really trying to detect the threats early, mobilizing a team we put together sort of a well-established issues management task force, and it's really to mobilize all of the key players that have expertise, have the background that we need, and we can pull in outside partners to help us almost in real time. We can mobilize it very quickly. So I think that, really just, being careful too about what kind of content you put out there publicly, because, if you're putting personal information or details about some of your employees, your leadership, or your physician, it does make you much more of a target.
Thank you for that, Eileen. I am once again. Oh, sorry, please. Of course, Larissa, please.
Yeah, no, I love this question about making sure that threat intelligence is actionable for senior leaders, and I feel like I just wanted to say that it really is sort of a two-way street. I mean, what makes something actionable for a leader, right? It's got to be relevant, it's got to be timely, it's got to be measured. And so I think oftentimes, analyst teams are producing reporting, but it just seems like, oh, maybe we're not answering the right questions that leaders want to know. And so I just wanted to underscore the importance of being able to, kind of meet in the middle and better understand, what are the decisions that my senior leadership is going to make? What are the tools that they have in their toolkit? And how can I, doing this analyst work, support that? And I just wanted to underscore that, because it seems like a very simple thing to do, but I know it is a challenge in a lot of organizations. And so just wanted to add to what Eileen mentioned.
No, I appreciate that. And for everyone out there who wants to be a moderator on the webcast, make sure that other speaker doesn't want to say something before you move to the next question. That's a good lesson to learn if you're a moderator. I'm going to learn that one day, hopefully. I want to get another audience question in here. And this is an interesting one. Honestly, I'm not sure who's the best person to answer, so I'm really going to put this out to the group. The question is this: are brands direct targets for narrative attacks, or are they used as vectors or amplifiers for broader efforts? It's an interesting question. I see the wheels turning there. I think I know who I want to answer this question, but I don't want to put them on the spot.
I can jump in.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah, no, I think the answer is both. It's not one or the other. What jumped in my mind immediately is, many of us work for a strong brand with a lot of credibility, and I think that makes us bigger targets. And the example I use that, now they're even making fake doctors that don't even exist, with fake names, fake identities, fake specialty, but they're using the Weill Cornell Medicine brand to leverage and make money, I guess, off of our brand. So I would think it's a both. Just my 2 cents.
I appreciate that. Before I go on, I want to make sure that Larissa or Frankie don't want to say something. I don't want to make that mistake again. Aha, see, okay, cool. Okay. So I want to actually, my God, this is going so fast. We only have 12 minutes left. Geez, time flies when you're having a really great conversation. So I want to move on to the final section of our conversation. And again, I have one question for each of you. And Larissa, I seem to always start with you, so why change now? We've talked a lot today about the gap between sophisticated adversaries and traditional corporate defenses. From where you sit in Toronto, had to get that in there, what is the single most critical step an organization could take tomorrow, or maybe today, to start bridging that gap and building narrative resilience? I like that term, narrative resilience. I like that.
Yeah, I like that term too. So I think, coming from the national security community, I think one thing I've learned, and I don't know, Frankie, if you feel the same way, but this, constant preparation and constant exercising. And I feel like that's a really good lesson learned or exercise to bring into, the corporate world as well. Militaries have recognized historically for a long time the people who they protect are being targeted every day. And so that is why they are constantly red teaming. And I think this is something that the corporate world should do more of. I would say, mapping your vulnerabilities, understanding how you might be, how those vulnerabilities might be exploited or targeted by bad actors, and then putting together a process and a response plan for that. I think because when a crisis happens, everyone needs their marching orders, and at that stage, it's a bit late to start trying to figure out what to do. So I think, from a resilience perspective, that type of preparation is really important.
Mm-hmm. Frankie, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Larissa covered, most points there. No.
Good. Okay, good. Well, I'll get to you, Frankie, with another question in a second, but Eileen, I want to bring something to you now. So given how fast and sophisticated future threats are now evolving, what is the most important mindset shift that leaders need to make to address this challenge? And this might actually ask you to repeat a couple of things you said before, but this is so important that if that's the case, I'm more than fine with that.
Yeah, thank you. I think, it's always a work in progress, but I think because of the nature of these issues have changed so dramatically, it's really a huge team effort that requires many perspectives and areas of expertise. It's beyond just the normal crisis communication group coming together to try to figure out what problem do we need to solve? How do we, kind of respond to the press? It's really much beyond that. We include security, legal, IT compliance, patient privacy, because many of these, especially in the healthcare industry, are, violations of patient information, sensitive patient information, bringing in outside experts, which I've said a few times. I think remembering, often that even real or perceived threats, even if they're, fake news or fake information, they can still cause significant anxiety among those impacted. The example I gave, like a doctor, I referenced about her identity being stolen, or an employee who is experiencing doxing, or a patient who can't get critical medication that they need. This requires also a level of empathy, while you're handling these issues to help really vulnerable individuals. And I think, to what Larissa said, I completely agree. Having, not just a playbook and mapping out where you're most vulnerable, but really practicing as a team, continuously learning together, and pay attention again to like what you're seeing, because I'm now seeing the same situation happen over and over and over. And when we see it happen, we can identify it faster and we can resolve it quicker.
Okay. Thank you for that. And now, Frankie, I am going to bring this into you now. I'm actually this is a question I'm really, really happy to ask, because look, a lot of what we've been talking about, it's a little scary. It's a little bit overwhelming. There's no doubt about it. So this is a question I really appreciate. From an operational standpoint, how do we measure success in this new environment? When you are dealing with invisible seeding stages and fast-moving narratives, what does a win actually look like for a defense team?
Well, measuring success has always been difficult. Even in measuring communications, there have been so many different theories. So measuring success here is where many organizations unintentionally use the wrong scorecarding system. So they are measuring success as the number of debunked false claims, or reducing the negative sentiment, or correcting misinformation, or winning an argument. But I think influence operations are rarely defeated by proving something is false. They're defeated by preventing the desired behavioral outcome. And this is more difficult. So just imagine two different scenarios. So in the first scenario, the narrative reaches social media and national media, reaches influencers, reaches the investors, and the company goes into full crisis communications mode and spends weeks debunking all the claims, and everybody has seen the crisis. In the second scenario, that same narrative, as Larissa mentioned before, is detected during the seeding at a very early stage. So on these fringe networks, or with known communicators that seed these narratives. The stakeholders are already prepared. The third-party validators are engaging. Media framing never solidifies, and the story actually never breaks through. So nobody outside of the response team will actually ever know that this has happened. And I think the most important wins are rarely seen by the audience. So if the audience hasn't seen anything, see it as a big win, I would say.
No, thank you for that. Okay, I want to make sure. I want to make sure that Larissa, you didn't want to say something. I'm going to assume not. Now, this is really cool. One person in our audience actually isn't asking a question. They actually made a statement, and I think it's kind of an interesting one. I kind of wanted to get your take on it. She says it's not narrative resilience; it needs to be trust resilience because the trust infrastructure has been fundamentally changed with AI. She says it's my 2 cents. Personally, I think it's worth a lot more than that. But I'm curious, what do you guys think of that statement? That's an interesting one.
Indeed, that's what I mentioned in the beginning. They're aiming at trust because trust is the most important factor. And we shouldn't forget that it has become cheaper and it has become way easier to create these false narratives. 20 years ago, we all remember the troll factory in St. Petersburg where 600-700 Russian operatives were creating these false narratives. Now it can be a single person somewhere with just AI tools creating native language content, localized narratives, using synthetic personas, as Eileen mentioned, and get these large volumes of supporting material. So those pink slime websites. So the campaigns can be run by just a proxy actor or a commercial competitor or a criminal organization. It has become so easy and so cheap, actually.
And just to add to that, it's the way some threat actors work, and some nation states even. The purpose isn't always to sell one side of the story. It is to overwhelm and exhaust the audience to the point where they are apathetic and where they don't know what to believe. And so that trust is lost. And I think, definitely AI has a role to play here. And it's really interesting how it's being used today. It's not even the ability to be able to create content using AI and to really scale that. And then also to be able to, to use AI to also amplify all those narratives. I think that is quite scary. But then also in addition to that, I think what is tricky is you see a lot of threat actors today using AI to help make sure that their online influence campaigns are persistent and they're enduring, and that they're not being detected by the trust and safety teams of the platforms. And so I think absolutely it all comes down to trust, but it's also not all doom and gloom. I mean, the defenders also have AI on their side. I want to add that as well. But I would absolutely agree with that statement.
No, thank you. I'm sorry, Eileen, go ahead.
Oh, I'll just add one quick thing. I agree completely with trust. That's key, certainly in healthcare and other industries. One thing that we found helpful was to, connect with our like-minded institutions, our peers, our competitors, and pull small groups together to really discuss these kind of activities and, share best practices and what are you doing and how are you handling these things. And it's very helpful to see what other organizations are doing that are facing similar challenges.
No, thank you for that. And, there's one of the things that I really, really want to say now because we're very, very close to the end here, is that we have probably gotten more audience questions today than any other webcast that I remember. Clearly, we were not able to get to all of them today. So before I say anything else, I do want everyone out there to know that all the questions that we did not get to, Blackbird is going to try to answer them offline. I just got approval from Blackbird to say that. So Larissa, don't look at me like I'm crazy. I promise that's what they said. But because we really appreciate all the questions you sent in. We only have an hour today, but I want you to know they didn't just go into the ethosphere and just disappear. We are going to get to them because they're some really, really good questions. We want to give you the best answers that we can. So I definitely wanted to mention that as well. And, really, really quick, 20 seconds each. One major takeaway that you'd like everybody to leave this webcast with before I get into my closing comments. I want Larissa to go last because I've always gone to her first, and that's not fair. So, Eileen, I'll start with you.
This is hard stuff, and everybody is challenged by this. That's okay. I think it's going to take time to really get through some of these very difficult challenges. I think what Frankie said earlier kind of terrifies me because I think it is sometimes it's one actor, sometimes it's a whole bunch of actors. So just know that you're not alone. And I would encourage you to reach out to some of your peer institutions to, kind of share best practices.
Awesome. Now, okay, Frankie, and try to unterrify our audience a little bit.
Well, I don't want to sound all doom and gloom, but let's say it'll get worse before it gets better, but it will get better. So the tools in fighting the narratives or in detecting the narratives are getting better, but it will take time as well. But we'll get there. I'm confident when companies work together, and as Eileen said, if organizations are sharing the information, it'll get better as well.
Well, as usual, we will have to turn to our Canadian friend over here to make us all feel a little bit better. So, Larissa, what say you?
I would say you can't defend against the threats that you don't see. So invest in a capability that allows you to have that situational awareness so that you can protect your organizations.
Thank you so much for that. Now, this is never the easiest topic to talk about, but I cannot thank Eileen, Larissa, and Frankie enough for bringing such clarity and terrific counsel on this. Such an important conversation. So on behalf of PR Week, as well as our audience, I sincerely thank Blackbird AI for sponsoring today's event. And of course, much gratitude to Larissa, Frankie, and Eileen for taking time from their very busy schedules to join us today and share their vast expertise. I also want to thank all of you, our audience. I truly appreciate your participation today. Hope you got as much out of this webcast as you were hoping, if not more. Again, remember the questions we didn't get to today, they will be answered. Please give Blackbird AI a little bit of time before they get back to you, but they will get back to you. And today's webcast also will remain available on demand for a year. So you could revisit it and certainly tell others who did not attend today to do so. Now, also, don't forget the handouts tab for those extra materials on our subject today, courtesy of Blackbird AI. And of course, I welcome you all to check back on prweek.com/US for future webcasts, as well as previous ones on demand. For now, on behalf of PR Week and Blackbird AI, I want to thank all of you for attending this webcast, the Narrative Attack Influence Operation Playbook. Until next time, this is Gideon Fiddles. I'm wishing you all the best. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.